Mary Ann and John Starkweather were prominent Ypsilanti citizens in the 19th century. Their legacy now carries over through Eastern Michigan University and the historical community. In 1841, the newlyweds bought 160 acres in Ypsilanti, building the Greek Revival farmhouse on the property with the address 1266 Huron River Drive. By 1874, the Starkweather farm had grown to 400 acres, covering what is now the campus of Eastern Michigan University. The Starkweathers grew what was considered one of the best orchards in Michigan, where they grew grain, raised horses, and built a racetrack. The Starkweathers were not only prominent farmers, they were also abolitionists. Their farm served as a stop on the Underground Railroad. The slaves would follow the Huron River all the way up from Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas to escape to their freedom in Canada. The Starkweathers would hide the slaves in their crawl space and help them escape to freedom. George McCoy, who lived in a cabin on the Starkweather property at the time, would hide the freedom seekers in the false bottom of his wagon when he would make stops in Detroit to sell cigars. When the renovation started on the Starkweather house, artifacts were found in a crawl space, such as toys, chairs, and broken clay dishes. The renovator, Ronald Rupert, believes they left behind by runaway slaves.
I think one of the more important things that they were abolitionists, and they definitely contributed to the Underground Railroad, which this was remarkable at that time for someone of their quality and standing, because they could be fined or put in prison, and you know, at that time it was not the thing to do.
John and Mary lived in the farmhouse for 34 years until they moved into the city. It was at their 130 Huron Street home that John passed away in 1883. After her husband's death, Mary was quite generous with the Starkweather fortune. Mary Ann gave money and property to Eastern Michigan University. She also gave money to the city, along with the Heave Fountain on South Huron Street, the Starkweather Memorial Chapel at Highland Cemetery, Starkweather Hall, and her North Huron Street home to the Ladies' Library Association. The Starkweather Memorial Chapel was Mary Ann's gift to her deceased husband in Highland Cemetery. In 1886, Mason and Rice, who were also designing the Grand Hotel at the time, were selected for the job. The completed memorial contained 12 art glass windows from the Tiffany Glass Company of New York City. The chapel was used when the deceased were often presented in their homes for visitations and then moved to smaller chapels for services before burial. This all changed in the 1920s, and the Starkweather Memorial Chapel was no longer used. Today, the chapel is visited regularly on tours by the Historical Society. Starkweather Hall was built in 1896 as one of the very first buildings on Eastern Michigan's campus. Mary Ann dedicated it to the university under the condition that it was only to be used by the Student Christian Association. When this group disbanded in the late 1920s, the Office of Religious Affairs held it until 1976. Supposedly, there have been reports of high paranormal activity at Starkweather Hall ever since it stopped holding religious activity. The campus building has been most recently used as the Honors College. Mary Ann Starkweather had donated so generously after John's passing, the only thing left to give was her own home. She gave the huge brick building on Huron Street to the Ladies' Library Association in 1890, earning the carved limestone sign above the door. Into the 1990s, the building was turned over to the city of Ypsilanti and served as the public library until the mid-1960s. The fate of the Starkweathers' very first home in Ypsilanti came about in the 21st century. There was a possibility in the summer of 2003 that the historic Starkweather farmhouse at 1266 Huron Drive might be demolished. In August of 2004, the Ypsilanti City Council appointed a Historic District Study Committee. They became in charge of providing legal protection for the Starkweather farmhouse. Finally, a resolution in 2005 was passed, and the Ypsilanti City Council created the Starkweather Historic District. Now that it was a historical district, the home must be reconstructed just as it was at the time the Starkweathers built it. This meant no modern materials and historically correct architecture.
Everything that I did in the building and the exterior had to be approved, and even the engineering. I had to have a structural engineer come out.
Finally, 165 years later after the home was constructed, it could be rightfully protected. As a part of the second largest historical district in the state of Michigan, the 1266 Starkweather property needed to be saved so it could be presented to the community for years to come. The historical district just needed someone to take on the task of renovating the mansion back to its original greatness. Ypsilanti resident and retired builder Ronald Rupert became the developer behind the Starkweather house renovation in the spring of 2008.
Bid, and I got it for $1, plus $7,500 worth of attorney fees and taxes and everything else that it ended up with. So after, this is what, the 8th year, 9th year, I've put over $200,000 into the building, and I have one more apartment to in the back to refurbish and bring back to life.
The estate had several different owners after the Starkweathers moved. It eventually was subdivided and developed into land for new residential buildings and Eastern Michigan University. The house itself took a similar route, eventually being split into 3 apartments and becoming somewhat deteriorated from decades of neglect. The house was structurally sound, but big sections needed work, and that included the foundation. The siding needed to be replaced and the front porch reattached. As for the inside of the building, electrical, heating, and plumbing systems required replacement and updates. And because of the date it was built, the house was never hooked up to the city sewers and its septic system. Ron expected to spend several $100s rebuilding the mansion and wanted to make it about a 5-year project.
This has been a real labor of love and dedication. Anyone else would have torn it down had it been in a different situation, but I love the house and the history of the town, and it just it's been well worth it.
Restoring such a historical building that held such influential people has brought great opportunity to Ypsilanti and Eastern Michigan University. Without Ronald Rupert's contribution to the Starkweather home, their legacy as abolitionists would never have been preserved. And without the Starkweather family, especially all of Mary Ann's generous donations, Ypsilanti as well as Eastern Michigan University would not have flourished and grown at such an early date. It's safe to say that the area owes much thanks to these prominent citizens that once created a land that would benefit an entire community years and years after their time.